Lupin III's very first anime series is a fantastic show with several classic episodes. That is stating the obvious, but the question remains, which Part 1 episodes are the tops and which ones should be left behind? I promised I would do a video ranking all the Part 1 episodes, and although it took me far longer than I thought it would, I finally put my list together. I watched all 23 episodes of this series and ranked them based on the writing, the heist or adventure, how the characters are used, and to a lesser extent, the animation and style because this series is over 50 years old. For the record, I watched these episodes in Japanese, not English, and this is not a ranking indicative of the dubbed episode's quality. Now there's quite a lot to discuss, so here's every Part 1 episode ranked, starting at the very bottom. There's a lot to be said for the slow, methodical pace of the Osumi-led Part 1 episodes, as when it's done right, it makes the episode feel very tight and well constructed, building on tension and using the action as a linchpin for gripping storytelling. When it isn't done right, the episodes are far too much of a slow burn and tend to fizzle out far before the credits roll. That's the case with Farewell My Beloved Witch, which certainly isn't terrible on its own, but just can't compare to the rest of this series. It's the first episode that's not just a direct manga adaptation, although it takes a few cues from some of the first series chapters. That might be part of the reason why this episode fails, because it feels too wrapped up in the cooler and methodical style of the manga, but doesn't have the story chops to back it up. It tries to balance a story of Lupin falling for a young woman and a battle for a flower with destructive capabilities, but the way it ties them together feels sloppy and arbitrary. I'm just not invested in any of these characters, as Linda and the Doctor feel especially lacking as characters of the week. The villain Stern is also not very interesting, and looks way too much like Jigen with that beard. Even the decent moments in this episode, which just boil down to some cool shots, are nothing you can find in other, much better episodes from this series. Farewell My Beloved Witch isn't a disaster or anything, but it marks a pretty low point for me thanks to being boring and unfocused. If it means anything though, I would take this episode over the worst episodes of parts 2, 3, and 6, which I guess is some consolation. After a long string of episodes that had completely new premises, the Part 1 crew adapted a chapter from the second manga series with Catch the Fake Lupin, albeit loosely. And while I like the idea of this one, it flounders quite a bit in practice. The concept of an isolated island nation following the guidebook of Arsène Lupin's thievery like it was a holy text is interesting, and that makes these set pieces far more unique. But it also disconnects them too far from the series' roots for my liking, as it quite literally strands Lupin and Zenigata on an island without giving them much to do. Lupin doesn't get the chance to really strut his stuff here. I see what they were going for by putting him in a compromised position, but rather than show his ingenuity, it just makes him seem more incompetent, which I don't think was the intention. Plus, this might be the worst written episode in the series. Whether it's the Japanese script or the discotheque subtitles, I can't say for sure, but every plot beat seems very lazily stitched together, as if they needed to hit all the marks but didn't have the connective tissue sorted out. The only thing that saves this from the bottom spot, honestly, is that boulder scene, which is pretty fun. Everything else about this episode is thoroughly forgettable. Operation Jewel Snatch is the first episode where the Lupin gang drives a Fiat 500, so on that front, it is notable. On all other accounts, this one is a dud. This episode is just kind of a nothing burger, with a back and forth conflict between Lupin and Fujiko with a jewelry store owner getting in the mix that's underbaked and far too slow for its own good. It's a very simplistic idea. Fujiko betrays Lupin and Jigen, and the boys try to get their gems back, and unfortunately, it's a very trite example of that storyline. Fujiko betrays Lupin all the time, but it usually doesn't make up the entire storyline. And you can understand why, as seeing an entire episode around that concept is pretty unpleasant. You know you've done something wrong when a Miyazaki-led episode has a flat and uninteresting plane sequence. That man is a master of aircraft scenes, and this one is a huge letdown. The final conflict in that cliffside hut is okay, I guess, but it doesn't make up for the rest of the episode being lackluster. Operation Jewel Snatch is a sort of all-action, no-flash episode that might entertain you if you're a newcomer, but has very little to return to. There's just not much in Operation Jewel Snatch to recommend, and the end result is an underwhelming and way too straightforward adventure. A lot of Part 1 episodes have a great premise and setup, but drop the ball in their second halves. Rainy Afternoons Are Dangerous has the opposite problem, as while I think the first couple of scenes are very weak, the climax and resolution are pretty solid. The core concept of a mob boss locking away his memory and the gang trying to restore it isn't bad, but it doesn't execute this idea well at all. The stakes and conflicts just isn't set up very well, and considering the mob boss dies halfway through, there's no real mystery about his past or anything like that. He's just a target for the gang to fight over, and that's it. By contrast, the planning and chase that makes up the second half, even if it's not that well done, is at least entertaining. This is the first fully planned out heist scene in the series, which is interesting that it happened 6 episodes in, and it's not a bad one. Also, shout out to Rock Iron Hammer, a character who's on Lupin's heist crew for like a minute and is never heard from again. While there are some good moments, especially in its climax, it can't fully make up for an uninteresting idea that leaves little for the viewer to get invested in. In a sense, the Altogether playing card operation is a very important episode, as this is the first Lupin anime episode to, from the moment it starts, be about Lupin, Jigen, Fujiko, and Goemon undertaking a big heist, and Zenigata being on their trail all the while. You might also know this episode as the one that adapts the same manga chapter as the pilot film, as the finale is essentially the same. However, the episode itself is very lackluster, with a strange, superstitious twist on things and a jumble of scenes that feel very unstructured. This one suffered heavily from the change in directors, as while the A production style is evident, it feels lost in a sea of ideas. Something tells me a remake of the pilot film's final scene was done mostly as a cost-cutting measure, not that they reuse a lot of animation or anything, but rather tracing over a lot of the assets and rewriting a pre-existing script. Beyond that, every other scene is so loosely connected that it ends up as a confusing mess. At its best, the Altogether playing card operation is a rudimentary and uninspired take on the Lupin formula. At its worst, it's a lackluster hodgepodge of ideas and scenes. In any case, it's just not very good. Especially when you compare it to the modern series, Part 1 does feel incredibly analog with its use of contemporary technologies like radio, walkie-talkies, and older phones. The First Move Wins computer operation is the first show to base its entire premise around an outlandish piece of futuristic tech, and as such, it is technically the first sci-fi Lupin episode. That's cool on its own, but I've never really cared for how this episode progresses. The animation is pretty good, and that's about all it has going for it. It's not a bad adventure by any means, but the action isn't really there and the script feels fairly sloppy. I don't care that much about the heist, and the Lupin gang aren't written very well here, especially how Lupin essentially abandons Jigen and Goemon. That seems very backwards. I also don't like how Zenigata is treated in this one, as he switches between unnecessarily pouty and too downtrodden for my tastes. It doesn't even really explore the whole can modern technology beat Lupin's old school methods idea that much. It just sort of ends with the, oh never mind, the computer isn't that good after all ending, with no satisfying conclusion. Part 5, this ain't. I appreciate them going for a different track with this episode and dealing with a fantastical piece of technology, but this is the kind of story that would take a while to be perfected. It goes to show that Part 1 is at its best when it doesn't try to tie itself to emerging trends. That's what Part 2 is for. You know those Lupin stories that feel like they're trying to just imitate Castle of Cagliostro? Well, here we have an interesting wrinkle in that it happened years before Cagliostro. This episode was planned out before A production took over, to be fair, but Miyazaki and Takahata heavily altered the script and essentially made it their own. And the end result? Well, this is basically an early draft of the movie that would later redefine the series. The direct comparisons are obvious, a counterfeiting scheme in an isolated nation with a sleazy and obviously evil man trying to take over and a woman beset by his ambitions. I mean, there's no bride and the snowy setting is unique, but all the basic elements are there, even the clock tower set piece and Lupin and Jigen throwing out the fake bills. That's the most interesting thing about this episode, however. Calling it the first draft of Cagliostro might be a basic take, but this episode does have an amateurish quality. It is cool to see a Lupin story not tied to a manga chapter in any way, proving that the characters can work in an original capacity rather than just adapting Monkey Punch's scripts, even if, again, Cagliostro would eat its lunch. The problem is, even if you don't compare this episode to Cagliostro, you have to compare it to the rest of Part 1, and on that front, it's far from the best of Lupin's early adventures. From one wintry episode to another, we have Who Had the Last Laugh, which is, in my opinion, the most middle-of-the-road episode of the entire show. It has solid pacing, solid action, solid use of the main crew, solid secondary characters, and is overall a solid episode. But that's the thing, this episode is merely solid. There's nothing in here that's particularly bad, but it isn't assembled in a way that makes it stand out amongst the crowd. It starts off promising, with a quick introduction and Fujiko pursued by bad guys, but from there, it's almost entirely set up for a big conflict. Which would be fine if the waiting period was enjoyable, but when you only have a handful of moderately well done scenes, the end result isn't going to wow anybody, I'd imagine. Admittedly, Who Had the Last Laugh takes a little while to get going, but once it does, it's an enjoyable, if not phenomenal episode, with a pretty decent climax at least. It doesn't really have a memorable element, landing it comfortably in the middle, far away from the upper echelon. Some of the episodes below this one might technically be more exciting or interesting, but Who Had the Last Laugh is, at the very least, consistently pleasant. I honestly don't know if I'm not giving this episode enough credit, and I'm sure the hardcore Goemon fans out there are probably seething that the Coming of Goemon the 13th is listed this low. Goemon was introduced to the manga to bring an Eastern flair to a very Western-influenced manga, and that's true here as well, as this is the first decidedly Japanese episodes of Lupin. The locations have a distinct rustic Japanese charm that you don't see often in this series, which is pretty neat. Goemon's introduction does feel all the more bizarre in retrospect because it's one of the very few instances Goemon is portrayed in a purely antagonistic light. And on that note, the actual fighting between Lupin and Goemon is awesome, showing the cunning and intelligence of both and ramping up the intensity. It's undoubtedly a highlight moment. Unfortunately, they fumbled it hard in the ending because everything involving Goemon's mentor and his scheme to kill Lupin and Goemon is just bad. It hinges the whole thing on a stupid misunderstanding and then brings in an aggravating twist that just makes the whole thing seem utterly infuriating, which doesn't get any better when they immediately walk back on the whole thing. While Goemon definitely steals the show in his first appearance and the fighting between him and Lupin is fantastic, it can't save this episode from its severe plot shortcomings. Keep an Eye on the Beauty Contest is a frustrating episode for me, as while I really like the idea and think the Lupon gang handles the situation very well, it doesn't have enough steam to carry it through to the end. The idea of using a beauty contest as a cover for auctioning stolen artwork is really cool. You have to maybe stretch your imagination a bit to expect a criminal syndicate like this to make a plan that's right out in the open, but the plan is so subtly eccentric that I have to enjoy it. And, you know, these are rich douchebags, so of course they're gonna do something very idiosyncratic like this. While the setting and plot doesn't lend itself to a ton of action, I like how the Lupon gang introduces their brand of chaos as a disruptive force that brings excitement to the proceedings. And I don't know why, but I also get a kick out of seeing them really fall into the role of a TV crew. It's cool seeing them in disguise for the majority of the episode. However, while I think the first 2/3 are pretty good, the stuff on the island isn't that great of a finale. It's a little bit too hectic for my taste, and while I love how Lupin and Zenigata take the smugglers down, it doesn't quite stick to landing thanks to a lack of focus. While this episode is a personal dark horse favorite of mine, objectively, I don't think it really shines that much among the other episodes. I wouldn't usually point to Part 1 as an especially great series for Fujiko, as she rarely gets a spotlight moment, but one that's definitely worth a watch is A Hitman Sings the Blues, the last episode of the series directed entirely by Osumi, and a pretty solid one for him to end his unshared run on. Fujiko doesn't always get the best storylines in this series, as she's usually in the background or purely an obstacle. Her past is far more mysterious than the others, and the fact that we got a bit of backstory on her this early is pretty interesting. Not that it's a particularly revelatory side of her, but it sets up the main conflict in the present incredibly well. Technically, Fujiko is objectified pretty hard here, but not in the usual sense. She is the objective that Lupin and Poon are fighting over, as she's injured for most of the episode and not able to fight for her own survival until the end. It's not that she's particularly sexualized or put upon here, but if she were able to, act on her own accord in this storyline, it would make it even better. Still, it's a good time and a gripping watch, especially with the animation and storyboarding. Love the perspective shift in this scene in particular. I wish this episode got better use out of Fujiko, but the premise is intriguing and we get some nice insight into her life before the Lupon gang, which makes for an interesting watch. As the anti-penultimate episode of Part 1, it should be no surprise that Rescue the Stubborn Tomboy has Hayao Miyazaki written all over it. Think about it, a feisty and strong young woman trapped in a hopeless situation who's rescued by a dashing young princely figure as the two go on an adventure together. It may be less Cagliostro than Hunt Down the Counterfeiter, but it's got so many of the hallmarks of his scripts that it's worth a comparison. It's the earliest example of Lupon acting entirely in somebody else's interest, even if the subject of that rescue doesn't realize it at first. Lupon isn't doing this because he wants something selfish, this is a favor for an old friend and a noble cause. It's a very Miyazaki take on this character, especially as Lupon has to pretend that he's doing something far worse to protect young Rie. This episode doesn't quite feel as tight as it could be, as Jigen leaves the plot a bit too early and the stakes are set up too quickly. But the train sequence in the middle is quite a thrill, one of the best action set pieces in Part 1. I like this episode well enough, and I think it's worth a watch if you're cherry-picking episodes, but I do think it could have been much greater if it had been given more time to cook. Alright, this one's definitely going to get me into some trouble, but just missing out on the top 10, we have Beware the Time Machine. I know a lot of people love this episode, and hey, I'm never going to argue with the episode that introduced Kiyosuke Mamo. He's one of the most iconic villains in this series for a reason. The way they present Mamo as a threat beyond Lupon's imagination is fantastic, and it's also awesome seeing Lupon reacting so cavalier to the whole thing. And yes, I really love the climax and how the gang gets their comeuppance on this guy. The destruction of the time machine is a fantastic scene that deserves all the love it gets. But here's the thing, I've always been cooler on this episode myself because while its premise and finale are excellent, the build-up doesn't always work for me. Lupon and Fujiko hanging out and marrying each other feels like a big waste of the concept, and it also bugs me how Lupon seems to figure out how Mamo does what he does without any further explanation. My personal feelings on this episode aside, I can't deny that it's one of the more unique stories in this show, and one of the first times the series really dared to go beyond the concept of Master Thief goes out and steals things. And for that, I suppose it deserves its praise. The Emerald Secret is the first episode that really shed the skin of the Osumi era and embraced the whims of Miyazaki and Takahata. It's true that Osumi still had some hand in planning other episodes after this, but this episode is full on A-production charm and whimsy, and the end result is pretty sweet. Taking place on a cruise ship, it's a lighter adventure that's all about the hunt for a missing jewel from beginning to end. This episode really peaks in the middle with the dancing scene, especially seeing Zenigata tear it up on that dance floor. The charming yet awkward way he reacts to it all is priceless, one of my favorite Zenigata moments from Part 1. In some sense, the Emerald Secret is kind of a one-scene wonder, as the chase for the Eye of the Nile is good, but kinda bare bones. I like seeing Catherine get the better of Lupon and Fujiko for a bit, while never losing that sly and unassuming smile though, and Lupon is also rocking that big mustache. It's a solid heist with plenty of fun interactions between Lupon, Fujiko, and Zenigata, and a unique setting that makes for a great watch. Lighthearted and more amusing than other episodes, but an enjoyable time nonetheless. A Wolf Calls a Wolf is Goemon's second episode and the one that cemented him as a Lupon gang member, and is, in my opinion, the far superior of Goemon's introductions thanks to a better premise and tighter execution. This is the first episode that Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata worked on, and you can tell that the transition isn't entirely smooth. There is an uneven mishmash of styles and some lacking animation here, which is a fate that a lot of Transition Era Part 1 episodes have, although this one wins the day with its excellent storytelling. What makes this episode shine is how Goemon himself doesn't steal the show, it's actually a pretty Fujiko-heavy episode, and that makes his role feel far more balanced. I absolutely adore the ending scene, where Lupon and Goemon have one more battle against each other that ends in the two finally realizing that they're kindred spirits. The incorporation of Lupon II as a part of the villain's backstory isn't that great, but I suppose it does lend credence to the idea of Lupon and Goemon joining forces over their shared history. As the episode that cemented Goemon's role in the rest of the series, it's a landmark story and one that's got enough action, character development, and laughs to warrant a watch. Here's an episode that I think is severely underrated, especially among Part 1 episodes. I think people mostly like When the Seventh Bridge Falls, but I never hear anyone talk about it when mentioning the best episodes of the show. I think it's one of the most captivating episodes in Part 1, and a surprisingly serious story for the A production team. The stakes are set up right from the beginning, with the villain framing Lupon for blowing up bridges and giving him a reason to go along with the plan for both his own safety and that of the young girl Lisa's. You can attribute his softer center to Miyazaki and Takahata, I'm sure, but I like that it's told through the lens of Lupon being under a villain's thumb the whole time. Everything in the first 2/3 is really good, but it's the finale that cements this as one of my favorites. It's wacky, but still down to earth, and that image of Lupon surfing behind the boat and especially firing his gun while handcuffed is an absolutely iconic image, and one that I think epitomizes the deliberate and nonchalant coolness of Part 1 Lupon. This episode is a non-stop thrill ride, setting up a fantastic idea and executing it solidly, leading to a final sequence that's one of the best of the series and an episode that I think deserves more love. The first ever episode of Lupon III is beloved by the community, and while I have some issues with it, I can't deny that Is Lupon Burning deserves its reputation. I like that they chose a location-driven story to start things out. Rather than just give us a blanket explanation of the characters and what they do, they throw him into a decidedly unaverage situation and show us how he'd react. But it's not completely out of left field, as this was adapted directly from a manga chapter, albeit with some alterations. It's a good way to introduce the characters, organically introducing their relationships and their skills. True to the form of Osumi-led Part 1 episodes, this one is absolutely entrenched in racing culture, with specific car manufacturers and drivers referenced. Those details may seem arbitrary, but part of early Lupon's charm is its fascinations with machines and modern culture. As an episode, the stakes are palpable and the sequences are memorable, but it can't help but feel like an odd place to start. It loses steam in the second half, particularly with Lupon's plumbing adventure and Fujiko's... well, let's just say this isn't a great episode for our favorite dame. Regardless, Is Lupon Burning is good fun, and has several memorable sequences, and I totally get why it remains a favorite among fans. From the first episode of Part 1 all the way to the last, the Great Gold Showdown goes out with a bang and then appropriately cools things out to let us enjoy the aftermath. It isn't the grandest or most enjoyable heist in this era of Lupon, but it is an incredibly awesome way to end the show after 23 episodes. I'm sure the team felt that this was going to be the last animated adventure for Lupon and wanted to make a great last impression, and on that front, they succeeded. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we knew that Lupon would continue far into the future, but had things not worked out as they did, this episode would have been a great send-off for our favorite thieves. The heist action is at one of its highest peaks here, with excellent comedic timing and tons of amazing chasing between Zenigata and Lupon. Seeing Zenigata under pressure to make sense of Lupon's scheme, which is admittedly very complex even for Lupon III, is fantastic. It may not end our list today, but it's a magnificent finale to a great series and one of the gang's finest moments in its freshman anime outing. If you'll pardon the expression, it's a golden episode indeed. Lupon Caught in a Trap has perhaps the best concept in all of Part 1, forcing the gang into a life or death situation and forcing them to do what they do best, not for any personal gain, but in order to save their skins from a crazed villain. They go in a very exciting direction with it. It's different from the example in When the Seventh Bridge Falls, as while that was a rescue op, this is purely about personal survival. I love that the heist is very improvised too. While it's got the intelligent planning you'd expect, it's all spur of the moment. The second half unfortunately suffers visually because unlike the rest of the series, TMS doesn't have access to a high-def transfer of this sequence anymore and has to rely on relatively low-definition footage. Considering how old this series is, it's remarkable that 98% of the show is preserved in high quality, so it's not a major complaint. It's not a mark against the episode itself, as it's not the animator's fault, but it is noticeable. Hard to harp on that for long when the adventure is so tightly constructed though. The episode creates a serious obstacle for the heroes and sets up the stakes while also having a blast letting the adventure unfold. I might have underappreciated this one for a while, but I've definitely come around to it as an incredible episode. Part 1 doesn't really tie into the Arsène Lupin stories all that much, trying to forge this Lupin as his own character, separate from the legacy of Maurice Leblanc's Gentleman Thief. Which of the third generation will win not only ties in specifically to Arsène Lupin as a figure in the Lupin III universe, it also brings in an element from the original French stories to great effect. Ganimard III is a great foil for both Lupin and Zenigata, displaying the same dogged confidence and intellect that Lupin has, while being more smarmy and cocky for Zenigata to bounce off of. But I also love that he doesn't quite understand Lupin III as an enemy. There's a lot of Holmesian adversity in this rendition of Ganimard that is at odds with Lupin's looser respect for reality. Just like when the Seventh Bridge falls, while the episode is enjoyable all the way through its first parts, it's the last scene that really cements this episode as a first-rate classic. Everything involving the France Fair is outstanding, from Lupin's outsourcing of the work, to Zenigata and Ganimard facing off against each other, to the incredible animation. Thanks to one of the best unique characters in the series and a wonderfully executed finale, which of the third generation will win is a chaotic but delightful gem. Right from the second the man they call the magician starts, you can tell that you're in for something special, and it only gets better from there. Not only does it have one of the most memorable villains in the entire series, but it also has a distinctly mature and serious tone that even stands out against the other Osumi episodes to make something truly captivating. This might be the best example of the series' early, cooler and less wacky bend. Which is interesting, seeing as how the villain can literally shoot fire out of his hands, and Lupin plays with a bunch of increasingly ridiculous firepower. In contrast to Is Lupon Burning, which shows Lupin triumphing at every turn, this episode cleverly puts Lupin in the crosshairs for most of its first half. If you're being pedantic, it is kind of odd how Lupin basically puts everything together in between the commercials, as if they couldn't figure out a middle to this one. But seeing him turn the tables on Paikal is awesome, and well worth the perhaps awkward structure. An iconic villain and a great sense of character development are just the tip of the iceberg, really, as this dark and twisted thrill ride is one of the best episodes of the series. One Chance for a Prison Break is the first real showcase for the Lupin and Zenigata dynamic, and actually only the second time the latter character appeared on TV, and it's one of the strongest of the franchise in terms of defining their relationship. Lupin gets captured all the time, but it's rarely ever shown in depth, usually just kind of being a plot obstacle. And it is here too, I suppose, but this episode explores how Lupin and Zenigata's pride fit into this relationship. It's deliberately repetitive, but it uses that to ground both the passage of time and the growing frustrations of Zenigata waiting for Lupin to do something. There's not a lot that actually happens in this episode, and that's the point. It isn't a lethargic story, but one that isn't afraid to take its time getting to the conclusion. I can see how its lack of action and repetitive nature might turn some people away, but for me, I think that makes the ending, which I will not spoil here, even better. One Chance for a Prison Break is a fantastic slow burn episode that reveals a lot about Lupin and Zenigata and how they react to each other, and shows just how cunning Lupin is in the face of seeming defeat. Part 1 has a lot of episodes where the gang has an outlandish plan, or goes to an exotic location, or tries to get away from the basic plot of the series. But Let's Catch Lupin and Go to Europe is not only the most well-plotted episode of the show, it shows why the core foundation and elements work so well. Sure, this isn't the most innovative or formula-breaking episode, but it triumphs over the rest by having a brilliantly executed story with no fat or trimmings to speak of. It's awesome seeing both the Lupin crew and Zenigata at the top of their game, while also faltering at so many points because they underestimate each other. It's non-stop Lupin shenanigans, which can be exhausting if it's not done well, but it works wonders here. It's a fantastic game of cat and mouse between the two sides, full of action, and having an ending that shows just why this cast works well together. With plenty of thrilling heist action and one of the best examples of the rivalry between Lupin and Zenigata to date, there is no doubt in my mind that Let's Catch Lupin and Go to Europe is the best episode of Part 1. Well, that's every episode of Lupon III Part 1 ranked. I know some of your favorite episodes probably got shafted, and I'm sure I rated some of your least favorite episodes much higher than you would have liked. So let me know what your favorite episodes from Part 1 are down below. Just, be civil about it. Before you ask, yes, I am planning to do this with the other Lupon series, but only after I finish their retrospective videos. Part 2 is next on that front, so the video shouldn't be too long after that big retrospective project is finished. And yes, I am aware that I have to rank 155 episodes for that video, and yes, it is a daunting task. I've got one more Lupon video planned for the year, but until then, I hope you all have a great night, and take care.